I stared at my phone screen until my eyes burned, watching those three little bubbles bounce the digital heartbeat of the girl who had once defined my entire existence. I had built a life, a real solid life across the country, but in the span of a single notification, I had managed to set it all on fire. How do you explain to the woman you swore to love for eternity that you threw it all away for a ghost from your past? And if I could go back and delete that message, if I could undo the moment I chose to open the door to a house I had already moved out of, would I be standing here in the wreckage of my own life? Or is this the ending I deserved all along? They say your first love never really leaves you, it just hides in the shadows of your subconscious waiting for a moment of weakness to crawl back out. My first love was Sarah. That's what we'll call her. When we were together years ago, she wasn't just a person, she was the sun, the moon, and every star in my sky. We were young, reckless, and deeply in love, the kind of love that feels like it's going to survive anything. But life isn't a movie, and the script we wrote for ourselves didn't account for the brutal reality of circumstances. One day the air just went out of the room. She ended things. There was no grand betrayal, no screaming match, just a quiet, devastating realization that we were headed in different directions. I remember the months that followed as a blur of gray. I lost my appetite. I'm not exaggerating when I say I couldn't taste food for a year. Every meal was just fuel. I didn't want a chore to keep a heart beating that felt like it had been surgically removed. I thought I would never recover. I thought the vacuum she left behind was permanent. But time, as cold and clinical as it is, does its job. I packed up my life, put 3,000 miles of concrete and mountains between us, and slowly, painstakingly, I started to heal. I learned to breathe again. I learned to enjoy the taste of a morning coffee, the sound of the rain, the feeling of not waking up with a stone in my chest. And then I met Elena. Elena was different, steady, warm, grounded. She wasn't the wildfire that Sarah had been. She was the hearth. She was the woman who taught me that love didn't have to be a battlefield. We built a home, we shared secrets, we planned for a future, and eventually we took our vows. I felt like I had finally arrived at the place I was supposed to be. I was a husband. I was a man with a purpose. I was safe. But the past has a long reach. Last week, the quiet equilibrium of my life was shattered by a single notification. My phone lit up on the nightstand, and there it was, a request from a familiar username I hadn't seen in half a decade, Sarah. My heart did that familiar treacherous thud against my ribs, the one I thought I'd silenced years ago. My fingers trembled as I clicked the profile. It was her. The same smile, the same eyes that used to know exactly what I was thinking. And then the direct message. She was reaching out not out of the blue, but with a specific heavy intention. She had broken off her engagement. The man she was supposed to marry, the man who had replaced me, was gone. She was alone, and she was looking for a bridge back to the only person who had ever understood her. I sat there in the dark of our bedroom, the blue light of the phone washing out the room, casting long, distorted shadows on the wall. Elena was sleeping soundly beside me, her breathing rhythmic and peaceful, completely unaware that a ghost was trying to claw its way into our bed. I had a choice. A binary choice. It was the simplest moment of my life, and yet it felt like standing on a cliff's edge. I knew what I should have done. I should have deleted it. I should have blocked her immediately and thrown my phone into the trash. But the what if is a dangerous drug. I wanted to know why. I wanted to know if she still felt the same ache, if she regretted the way things ended, if I was still the one she measured everyone else against. I felt a surge of pride of validation, and for a fleeting second, the boy who couldn't eat for a year felt seen again. I replied. It was just a few words of polite acknowledgement, but it was the crack in the dam. The conversation started small, like a leak in a pipe, but it quickly gained pressure. She told me about the breakup, about how unhappy she had been, about how she'd spent years wondering if she made a mistake by letting me go. She was painting a picture of a what could have been, and like a fool, I started to step into the frame. Every message she sent was a needle stitching me back into a reality that no longer existed. I wasn't thinking about the vows I'd exchanged with Elena. I wasn't thinking about the house we bought or the life we were nurturing. I was trapped in the seductive loop of my own nostalgia. I felt like I was cheating not just on my wife, but on my own progress as a man. I knew deep down that I was playing with fire. I told myself I was just being nice, that I was offering closure, but that was the biggest lie I'd ever told. You don't offer closure to an ex-lover at 2 a.m. while your wife sleeps 10 feet away. You're looking for a thrill. You're looking for a mirror to tell you that you're still desirable, still important. The guilt began to set in heavy and thick like a coat of wet cement. Every time Elena laughed at something I said during dinner or rested her hand on my knee, I felt like a fraud. I was keeping the secret, and it was starting to poison the air around us. I could see it in the way I looked at her, or rather the way I couldn't quite meet her eyes. I was disappearing into the screen, and I was losing the woman who actually loved me in the process. The guilt wasn't just a weight, it was a physical sensation. It sat at the base of my throat like a lump of iron that wouldn't go down no matter how much water I drank, or how many times I told myself it was just talking. I started noticing things I'd never seen before, the way Elena would pause for a second too long when she walked into a room where I was holding my phone, the way she would look at me with a soft, searching expression as if she knew something had shifted in the foundation of our house, but couldn't quite put a finger on the crack. I was living two lives. By day, I was the devoted husband, the man who helped with the chores and listened to her talk about her work. By night, in the stolen quiet moments, I was drifting back into the orbit of a woman who had once been my entire world. It was intoxicating. Every ping of the phone felt like a secret heartbeat. Sarah was masterful at it. She knew exactly what to say to make me feel nostalgic, to remind me of the specific, intimate language we used to share. She spoke of memories I had tried to bury, our first road trip, the way we used to dance in the kitchen, to music playing from a phone speaker, the specific brand of coffee we both liked. She was rebuilding our past in real time, and I was helping her lay the bricks. But the more I spoke to her, the more I realized that this wasn't about the past at all. It was about her need to feel validated in a moment of crisis. She had just blown up her own life by calling off an engagement, and she needed a safety net. She needed to know that the man who had suffered for a year because of her was still waiting there, still holding a candle, still capable of being pulled back into her gravity. I was a life raft, and I was letting her climb aboard completely oblivious to the fact that I was dragging my own ship down into the abyss with us. The turning point came on a Tuesday. It was a rainy, miserable evening, the kind that forces you indoors and makes you feel introspective. Elena was working late, and the silence in the house was deafening. My phone buzzed a long paragraph from Sarah about how she'd driven past our old favorite diner and started crying. It was designed to trigger every bit of tenderness I still had left. I started to type a reply, a long, emotional response that would have crossed every line in the book. My thumbs were flying, and I felt that familiar, dangerous rush, that sense of being understood by someone who knew the old version of me. But then the front door opened. The sound of her keys hitting the bowl, the rustle of her coat, the way she called out my name, "Honey, are you home?" It all hit me like a splash of ice-cold water. I dropped the phone onto the cushion next to me as if it were a live grenade. My heart was hammering so hard against my ribs that I thought she might hear it from the hallway. I looked down at the screen, then at the door, and for the first time, I saw the sheer blinding absurdity of what I was doing. I was betraying the most stable, loving, and kind person I had ever known for a memory that was already dead. I felt sick. Not the I ate something bad kind of sick, but the deep existential nausea that comes when you realize you're the villain in your own story. I spent the next hour in a state of hypervigilance. I acted perfectly normal, too normal maybe. I helped her with dinner. I asked about her day, but I was sweating underneath my shirt. Every time my phone vibrated with a message from Sarah, I flinched. I was terrified. I realized that if Elena ever saw those messages, it wouldn't just be a fight, it would be the end. And the terrifying part, I realized I didn't want it to be the end. I wanted to keep the house, keep the life, keep the woman, but I also wanted the thrill of the ghost. I was greedy and I was weak. That night lying in bed, I finally reached a point of unbearable clarity. I couldn't keep lying. It was eating me alive. I knew I had to end it, but I also knew that if I didn't tell Elena, the secret would always be there, a ticking time bomb, buried in our history. But how do you tell your wife that you entertain the idea of someone else? How do you explain that you let a ghost back in and that it nearly cost you everything? The coward in me wanted to just block Sarah and hope the secret died with the conversation. But the man I wanted to be, the man I wanted to be for Elena, knew that a marriage built on a secret, even a small one, wasn't a marriage at all. It was a performance. I lay there in the dark, listening to the steady rhythmic breathing of the woman I had promised to cherish above all others, and I felt the weight of my own hypocrisy crushing the air out of my lungs. Every time she shifted in her sleep, every time she instinctively reached out to brush her hand against my arm, I felt a fresh wave of shame. I was a fraud. I had allowed myself to be lured back into the orbit of a ghost, playing a dangerous game of what if. And in the process, I had turned my home, my sanctuary, into a place where I was effectively hiding in plain sight. I knew what I had to do, but the thought of it made me tremble. I had to kill the ghost. I had to take the phone block Sarah and close that chapter for good. But even more than that, I realized that if I really wanted to be the man Elena deserved, I couldn't just bury the evidence. A secret kept is a rot that eats at the wood of a marriage until the whole thing collapses under its own weight. I decided that the next day I would handle it. I would block Sarah and I would tell Elena. I told myself it was the honorable thing to do. I told myself that full transparency was the only way to save us. But deep down, I think I was just terrified that if I didn't confess, the guilt would eventually leak out in other ways, in my irritability and my distance, or in the inevitable moment where I'd slip up and accidentally reveal a detail I shouldn't have known. The next morning, the sun broke through the blinds, casting long, sharp rays of light across the room. It felt like an interrogation. I looked at Elena as she got ready for work, seeing the gentle way she brushed her hair, the genuine smile she gave me over her shoulder. She was so real, so present. And here I was, a man divided, holding a digital suicide note in my pocket. I waited until she left for the office. The silence of the house felt heavy, expectant. I picked up my phone and opened the chat with Sarah. It was a long, winding trail of confessions, flirtations, and emotional probing. It was a digital map of my own betrayal. I didn't overthink it. I didn't read back through the messages because I knew if I started reading, I'd get hooked all over again. I just hit the block button. It was a clinical cold action. Block user? Are you sure? Yes. The screen went blank. The connection was severed, the ghost was exorcised. But then came the harder part. I had to face the living, I had to face the woman I had actually betrayed. When Elena came home that evening, the house felt like it was charged with static electricity. She was humming to herself, happy talking about her day, and I was just standing there, a ghost of myself, clutching a glass of water like it was a shield. I knew I couldn't wait. Every second that passed made me feel more like a liar. I sat her down at the kitchen table. The wood felt cold under my palms. She looked at me, her smile faltering just a fraction, her brow furrowing with a natural immediate concern. "Hey, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." The irony almost made me laugh. I told her everything. I didn't sugarcoat it and I didn't make excuses. I told her about the DM, about the initial curiosity, about the thrill of the past, and about how I had spent the last few days in a fog of my own making. I told her I had blocked Sarah and that I was doing it to protect our marriage. I thought in my naive, desperate state that confession would be the catalyst for forgiveness. I thought if I laid my soul bare and showed her that I had chosen her over the ghost, it would be enough. I thought we would cry, talk it out, and then come out the other side stronger, tempered by the fire of this near miss. I was wrong. I was so incredibly, tragically wrong. As I spoke, the light in her eyes didn't just fade, it went out. It was as if a curtain had been drawn across her face. She didn't scream, and she didn't throw anything. She just sat there, listening her expression, turning into something I had never seen before, a cold, impenetrable mask of shock. The silence that followed my confession was the loudest sound I had ever heard in my life. It was a vacuum that sucked the oxygen out of the room. I watched her process the words, watched the realization hit her that the man she had woken up next to the man she had planned a future with had been mentally somewhere else for the last week. She wasn't just looking at me anymore. She was looking through me like I was a stranger who had just wandered in off the street. "So," she finally whispered. It wasn't a question. It was the sound of a heart snapping in two. She didn't cry. That would have been better, I think. Crying implies there's something left to salvage a fire that can still be stoked. Instead, there was just this hollow Arctic silence. She stood up her chair, scraping against the hardwood floor with a sound that grated against my nerves like a jagged blade. She walked over to the kitchen window and just stared out into the dark, her back to me. Every muscle in her body was coiled so tight I thought she might shatter. "You didn't just make a mistake," she said, her voice eerily calm, controlled, and devoid of the warmth I had lived for every single day. "You opened a door. You looked at the life we built, the promises we made, the home we chose, and you decided it wasn't enough. You had to see if the ghost was still waiting." I tried to reach out to touch her shoulder to explain that it was just a moment of weakness, just a fleeting obsession with the past, but she flinched away from my hand as if I were scorching hot. The rejection burned worse than a slap. It was the physical manifestation of the distance I had created. "Don't," she snapped, and for a split second I saw the rage beneath the ice, a white-hot, furious indignation that I had dared to bring another woman into the sanctity of our marriage, even if it was just through a screen. It was just messages, Elena. I blocked her. I ended it. I'm choosing you. I felt like a drowning man grasping at straws. She turned around then, and the look in her eyes was the most devastating thing I have ever witnessed. It wasn't just anger, it was clarity. She looked at me with a profound, terrifying disappointment. "You aren't choosing me," she said, her voice trembling now. "You're just settling for me because the ghost didn't work out on your terms. You blocked her because you were afraid of the consequences, not because you truly let go of what you had with her. How can I look at you now and see the man I married? How can I ever trust that the next time life gets hard, or you get bored, or you get curious about a what if, you won't turn to someone else again?" The air in the room felt heavy, pressurized. I was desperate. I started rambling. I'm embarrassed to admit it now, begging, promising, swearing that I would go to counseling, that I would do anything, give up anything to fix this. But the more I pleaded, the more she seemed to pull away, receding into a corner of her own mind where I wasn't invited. She wasn't fighting me anymore. She was grieving. She was mourning the version of me she thought she knew, the one who didn't keep secrets, the one who didn't look back. "I don't want to be with you anymore," she said. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a negotiation tactic. It was a statement of fact as final as a funeral bell. "I don't think I can be with you anymore. Because even if we stay together, I'll always be waiting for the next notification. I'll always wonder who you're talking to when you're quiet. I'll always know that you had a secret life while you were lying next to me. I deserve better than to be the second choice in my own marriage." She walked past me, then her footsteps echoing in the hallway heading toward the guest bedroom. She didn't look back. She didn't hesitate. She just walked out of our shared life, one room at a time. I stood there in that kitchen, the silence rushing back in to fill the space she had vacated. And for the first time in my life, I felt the true weight of my own actions. I had wanted the thrill of the past, the validation of a ghost, and in the process, I had successfully managed to lose everything. I lost my wife, the only woman who had truly built a future with me, and I had lost the ghost too, because I knew I could never ever go back to her after this. I had nuked the bridge, the shore, and the harbor. I was standing in the middle of a war zone of my own making, completely and utterly alone. I stared at the dark screen of my phone, the blocked contacts sitting there like a tombstone for my life. The silence in that house wasn't just the absence of sound, it was a physical weight that pressed against my chest, making every breath feel like a shallow, stolen effort. I sat at that kitchen table for hours, long after Elena had retreated behind the closed door of the guest room. The fluorescent light above the stove flickered a rhythmic, maddening pulse that seemed to count down the seconds of my dissolving marriage. I felt like a man who had walked into a house he'd spent years decorating only to find the walls had been torn down and the floorboards ripped away. I kept replaying the conversation in my head over and over like a scratched record. Every inflection of her voice, every shift in her expression was etched into my brain. I remembered the way she had looked at me not with hate, but with that hollow, terrifying resignation. If she had screamed, if she had thrown a glass, or told me to get out, I could have handled that. I could have defended myself, or apologized, or fought for us, but she hadn't fought. She had simply folded. She had looked at me and decided that I wasn't worth the emotional investment anymore. That realization was a cold, sharp knife to the gut. I thought about the year after Sarah and I had first broken up. I remember that hollow feeling that year of not being able to taste food the way the world had lost its color. I had spent so much of my life defining myself by what I lacked, by the people who left, by the versions of myself that hadn't worked out. When I finally met Elena, she was supposed to be the end of that cycle. She was supposed to be the happily ever after that grounded me. And for a long time she was, but the truth, the ugly, jagged truth I was forced to confront in that kitchen was that I hadn't actually healed. I had just been distracted. I had treated my marriage like a bandage. I hadn't gone through the work of truly letting go of the past. I had just found someone kind enough to provide a new, warmer reality to hide in. And the moment the past poked its head back into my life, the moment a ghost whispered my name from across the digital divide, I had panicked. I had reached for the familiar. I had reached for the what if. And in that desperate, selfish motion, I had proven to Elena exactly what she had feared, that she was never the center of my world. She was just the anchor I was using to keep myself from drifting back into the storm. I stood up, my legs feeling like lead, and walked as slowly toward the guest bedroom. Every floorboard creaked in the quiet, sounding like a gunshot in the dead of night. I stopped in front of the door. I wanted to knock, to beg, to promise that I would change, that I would go to therapy, that I would burn my phone, that I would do anything. My hand hovered over the wood, trembling. But then I heard it, the soft, muffled sound of her sobbing. It wasn't the kind of crying that invited comfort. It was the sound of someone breaking down in total isolation. I realized then that if I knocked, if I forced her to see me, I would only be adding to her burden. I had brought this nightmare into her life. I had walked into her safe space and detonated a bomb. Forcing her to listen to my apologies would just be one more act of selfishness. I lowered my hand. I walked away back to the master bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed. We had shared a bed that now felt like a mausoleum. The next few days were a blur of cold, clinical agony. We existed in the same house like ghosts haunting different parts of a cemetery. We didn't talk. We didn't look at each other. The air was thick with the wreckage of our lives. I tried to do the right things. I cleaned. I made coffee. I stayed out of her way, but everything felt performative, a desperate, pathetic attempt to fix a foundation that had already crumbled into dust. She didn't buy it. Why would she? I had given her no reason to trust me, and in the span of 1 week, I had dismantled years of trust. I started to reflect on Sarah. I thought about the messages, the way she had pulled me in, the way she had preyed on my own unresolved grief. Was she even a real person in this moment? Or was she just a mirror for my own lack of self-worth? She had broken her engagement, and she needed to know she still had power over me. She had used me to feel relevant, and I had been all too happy to oblige because I wanted to feel relevant too. We were two broken people trying to use each other as a bandage, and the only result was that we both ended up bleeding out in the end. I thought about the irony of it all. I had gone through such a long, painful process to get over her the first time. I had moved across the country, built a new identity, found a woman who loved me for who I was in the present, not who I had been as a young, lovesick kid. And I had thrown it all away for a digital ghost who probably hadn't even thought about me twice once the conversation hit a lull. It was the most expensive, most destructive mistake of my entire life. As the days stretched into a week of suffocating silence, I began to see my life not through the lens of what I had lost, but through the clarity of what I had destroyed. There were moments, fleeting and sharp, where I would walk into the kitchen and see her cup sitting on the counter, or catch the faint, lingering scent of her perfume in the hallway, and I would be struck by a wave of grief so profound I physically had to lean against the wall to keep from collapsing. It wasn't just that I was alone, it was that I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the bone that I was the one who had driven her away. I spent most of those nights in the guest bedroom staring at the ceiling, trying to untangle the mess of my own mind. I thought back to the night I got that message. It had started as a simple, innocent-looking notification, a little pop-up on the screen. I had been so proud of myself for getting over Sarah, for building this life with Elena. I had told myself for years that I was a reformed man, that I had moved past the trauma of my first heartbreak. But the reality was that I hadn't moved past it. I had just pushed it into a corner and built a house on top of it. When Sarah appeared, she didn't just walk into my life. She triggered a tripwire I didn't even know was there. The tragedy wasn't just the betrayal itself, the messages, the secrecy, the emotional infidelity. The tragedy was that I had let a ghost dictate the reality of my present. Elena didn't deserve to be a part of my war with my past. She deserved a husband who was fully present, a man whose heart wasn't split between the memory of a first love and the promise of a future. By keeping Sarah in the loop, I had effectively told Elena that she wasn't enough to make me forget. And for a woman who had given me everything, who had been my steady, warm, and loyal partner, that was a wound that couldn't be stitched up with apologies or promises to do better. I started to understand why she had shut down so completely. She wasn't just angry about the messages. She was mourning the realization that she had been living with a stranger. She had thought we were partners, equals in a shared life. Instead, she found out that she was just the person I lived with while I secretly pined for a version of my youth I could never reclaim. The trust didn't break because of a single interaction. It broke because of the realization that my heart was not actually in the room with her. I remember the last conversation we had before the silence became permanent. It wasn't a fight, it was a deconstruction. We sat on the couch, not close, but in the same room, and she looked at me with eyes that had lost all their sparkle. She didn't ask why, she asked how. How could I do this to her? How could I look at her day after day and hide such a massive part of my interior world from her? And I had no answer. I couldn't say it was an accident. I couldn't say it was just a friend, because it wasn't. It was a choice made over and over again every time I picked up that phone to reply to Sarah. I told her I was sorry, but the words felt like paper in my mouth. They were light, thin, and entirely insufficient to cover the wreckage I had caused. She just shook her head, a soft, sad motion. "You're sorry you got caught," she said. "You're sorry the dream of the past didn't turn out to be as good as the reality of us, but you aren't sorry for the betrayal itself. Because if you were, you would have told me the moment she messaged you. You wouldn't have waited until you were forced to choose." She was right. The brutal truth was that I was trying to have my cake and eat it too. I wanted the stability of Elena and the thrill of the what if from Sarah. I wanted the past and the present to coexist, and I was arrogant enough to think I could manage both. I had treated our marriage like a backup plan, a safety net that I assumed would always be there no matter how much I tested its limits. The weight of that realization was heavier than anything I had ever carried. I had lost the only person who had ever truly fully loved me, and I had done it by chasing a mirage. The house felt like a tomb. Every object in it, the pictures on the walls, the mugs in the cupboard, the way the light fell across the floor in the afternoon, reminded me of a life I had possessed and then, with my own hands, dismantled. I was a man who had everything, and in 1 week I had managed to turn it all into nothing. The days began to blur into a singular, agonizing routine of avoidance and cold silence. I would wake up in the guest room, the sheets feeling like sandpaper against my skin, and walk out into the hallway, heart-hammering, hoping for some sign, some crack in the armor she had built around herself. But Elena was a ghost in our own home. She moved with a quiet, efficient precision that was more terrifying than any shouting match. She was already detaching, pulling her roots out of the soil of our marriage one day, 1 hour, 1 minute at a time. Every time she passed me in the kitchen without making eye contact, I felt a piece of my soul wither. I had created a vacuum where a life used to be, and there was nothing left to fill it with but the echoes of my own monumental mistake. I started to obsess over the why. Why had I actually done it? Why had I let that first poisonous ping of the phone pull me back into a reality that had already rejected me years ago? I realized with a clarity that was almost physically painful that my first love had never really been about Sarah. It had been about me. It had been about the boy I was back then, the one who felt everything so intensely, the one who didn't know what it meant to be responsible for another person's happiness. When Sarah messaged me, she wasn't just reaching out, she was offering me a mirror. She was showing me the version of myself that didn't have to be a husband, didn't have to be a partner, didn't have to be the man who had his life together. She was offering me a return to a state of reckless, selfish adolescence. And like a fool, I had taken the bait. I thought about the night I had blocked her. I had thought I was being a good husband. I had thought the act of cutting her off was the ultimate proof of my loyalty. But looking back from the ruins of my marriage, I saw how pathetic that really was. Blocking her wasn't a noble act. It was a desperate, cowardly attempt to keep my secret buried so I wouldn't have to face the consequences of my own curiosity. I hadn't blocked her because I had outgrown her. I had blocked her because I was terrified of what would happen if the conversation continued. I was a man standing in a house he was setting on fire, and I was trying to blow out the matches just as the curtains caught. The nights were the hardest. The silence was absolute. I would lie in the guest room, staring up at the ceiling, listening for the sound of her moving through the house, terrified that one day I'd wake up and the house would be empty, that she would have finally packed the last of her things and left me to the void. The irony was so sharp it almost felt like a dark joke. I had moved across the country to escape the pain of losing Sarah. I had done everything right. I had built a career. I had fallen in love with a woman who was light years better than the version of myself I had been back then, and I had truly, deeply believed I was a different person. But the moment the opportunity for the old toxic what if presented itself, I folded, I regressed. I started to wonder if I was fundamentally broken, if there was something in my DNA that couldn't handle true happiness. Was I a man who only felt alive when there was drama, when there was a struggle, when there was a what if hanging over my head? Because that's what this was. I had been bored, or maybe I had just been too comfortable, and I had sabotaged the most beautiful, stable thing in my life just to see if I could feel the burn of that old familiar heartache again. It was the most destructive, selfish thing a person could do. I hadn't just cheated on my wife, I had cheated on the future we were supposed to share. One evening, I found her in the living room packing a small bag. She didn't look at me when I walked in. She was just folding a sweater with the same careful, methodical motion she used to fold my shirts. The sight of it, the finality of it, hit me like a physical blow. I couldn't breathe. I walked over and stood in the doorway, my hands trembling. "Elena," I whispered, my voice cracked. "Please, don't do this." She stopped, her hands resting on the fabric, but she didn't turn around. Her posture was stiff, defensive, and so incredibly distant. It was like she was already halfway to a life where I didn't exist. "You think this is just about a few messages?" she said, her voice small and brittle. "You think if you apologize enough, or if we go to a few sessions, the before will come back. But the before is gone, Sarah. It was gone the moment you read that first notification and didn't tell me. It was gone the moment you realized she was single and decided that was an opening." She finally turned, and the look on her face was one of pure, exhausted heartbreak. "I don't know who you are. The man I married wouldn't have kept that. The man I married would have known that the moment she messaged, she was a threat to everything we built. You didn't protect us. You left the door wide open just to see who would walk through." I had no defense. Everything she said was true. I had prioritized my own curiosity over her security. I had made her feel like an option in her own home. I watched her zip up the bag, the sound of the zipper acting like a period at the end of a long, tragic sentence. She was leaving, and for the first time, I didn't try to stop her with empty words or pathetic promises. I just stood there paralyzed by the weight of my own actions, watching my life, the real, beautiful, and hard-earned life, walk out the front door. The front door closed with a click that sounded like the finality of a gavel striking wood. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, and there was no grand confrontation, just the sound of a latch settling into place. She was gone. The house, which had once been filled with her warmth, her laughter, and the simple grounding rhythm of our shared life, suddenly felt like a museum of a life that no longer existed. I stood in the entryway for what felt like an eternity, listening to the silence pulse in my ears, waiting for the sound of a car engine to fade away into the distance. When the last hum of the tires vanished, the reality of the void finally took hold. I spent the next 48 hours in a haze that felt more like a fever dream than reality. I didn't eat, I didn't sleep. I just wandered from room to room, touching things that still held her imprint. The half-read book on the nightstand, the spare set of keys in the bowl, the coffee mug she'd left in the sink. Every single object was a jagged little reminder of my own catastrophic failure. I had convinced myself that I was a good man, that I was a husband who had simply had a momentary lapse in judgment. But as the quiet deepened, the delusion began to shatter. I saw myself clearly for the first time, a man who had been playing with fire, a man who had prioritized his own ego over the woman who had trusted him with her heart. I thought about the night I had initially responded to Sarah. I remembered the rush of it, the way my heart had quickened at the sight of her name, the way I had felt a sudden electric surge of importance. It was all so shallow. It was all about wanting to be remembered, wanting to be the one who got away, wanting to prove that I still had a flicker of that old youthful fire. And what had I gained? A few weeks of digital flirtation? A few days of illicit excitement? It was the most expensive price anyone has ever paid for a temporary hit of ego gratification. I had traded a life of substance for a digital mirage, and I had lost everything in the process. I started to think about Sarah again, but this time the anger began to burn through the fog of my regret. I realized that she had never cared about me. She had just needed a landing pad. She had reached out when her own world was collapsing, and she had used me as a crutch to help her walk through her own crisis. I was just a ghost from her past that she'd decided to haunt, and I had been foolish enough to let her. We were both just playing a game of what if, and neither of us had any intention of actually making it work. We were just two people who couldn't face the reality of the present, so we retreated into a fantasy that neither of us actually wanted. The irony was that in trying to keep Sarah's memory alive, I had killed the one thing that was actually real. My marriage was dead, and I had been the executioner. I had held the knife, and I had plunged it deep into the heart of the only woman who had truly loved me for who I was, not who I had been, not who I wanted to be, but the man I actually was every single day. I sat down at the kitchen table, the same place where I had confessed to Elena, and I opened my phone. I stared at the blocked notification on my screen. It felt like a tombstone. For a second, I had the urge to unblock her, to reach out to find some kind of comfort in the person who had started this entire catastrophe. But the thought made me sick. I didn't want comfort from her. I didn't want anything from her. I wanted to be back in that living room before the notification, before the temptation, before I let a ghost take over my life. I realized then that there was no going back. The man who had been married to Elena was gone. He had died in that kitchen the moment he decided to betray her trust. I started to write things down. I didn't know who I was writing to, maybe myself, maybe some imaginary audience, maybe just into the void. I wanted to document the stupidity of it the way I had let my own insecurities and my own desire for validation steer my ship into the rocks. I realized that the hardest part of all of this wasn't the loss of the relationship. It was the loss of my own integrity. I had lied to myself for years, telling myself I was over it, when I was clearly still a man who was haunted by his own past. I had never actually processed the end of that first relationship. I had just tried to outrun it, and the moment I stopped running, the ghost had caught up to me. The days following her departure turned into a hollow, rhythmic penance. I found myself obsessively cleaning the house, scrubbing surfaces that were already spotless, trying to erase the ghost of her presence, not because I wanted to forget her, but because the memory of her was a needle in my eye every time I walked into a room. The way the morning light hit the kitchen counter, the specific angle of the armchair where she used to read the lingering scent of her shampoo in the bathroom, it was all too much. I was living in a mausoleum of my own design, and every object was a tombstone for a version of myself that didn't exist anymore. I spent hours sitting in that silent house, finally forced to confront the absolute truth of who I had become. I wasn't just a man who had made a mistake, I was a man who had been hollowed out by a decade of unresolved grief, and I had used Elena to fill that void. That was the most devastating realization of all. I had looked at her warmth and her beauty, and I had viewed her as an anchor to keep me from drifting back to Sarah. But an anchor only works if you actually want to stay in the harbor. I had been drifting the whole time, and the moment the siren song of the past played, I had cut the line. I thought about the why again, but this time the answer wasn't about love or nostalgia. It was about ego. I had needed to know that someone from my past, someone who had once discarded me, still cared if I was alive, still wondered about me, still found me desirable. It was the most pathetic juvenile motivation possible. I was a man in his prime with a woman who had given me her life and her trust, and I had traded it for a hit of validation from a woman who had already shown me she could walk away. I was a puppet on a string dancing to the tune of a girl I hadn't truly known in years, and the price of my performance was my own soul. I started going for long, aimless walks at night. The city air was cold and sharp, and it felt like the only thing that could actually touch me. I would watch couples walking hand in hand laughing in the flickering orange light of the street lamps, and I felt like an alien observing a species I was no longer a part of. I had disqualified myself from that kind of connection. I had proved definitively that I was not a safe place for a heart to land. I had taken the most fragile, precious thing, Elena's trust, and I had smashed it against the wall just to see if it would break. And it did. It shattered into 1,000 pieces that I knew with a sick, sinking certainty could never be glued back together. There was a profound, suffocating irony to the whole situation. Sarah, the catalyst of this entire destruction, was now just a block on a screen, a non-entity. I didn't hate her anymore, and I didn't love her. I felt nothing for her but a cold, distant pity. She had been a tool in my own self-sabotage, and I had been a tool in hers. We had both been trying to use the other to fix something that was broken inside ourselves, and all we had succeeded in doing was creating more brokenness. I wanted to tell Elena that, but I knew it wouldn't change anything. It didn't matter what the catalyst was. The act was mine. The choice to open the message, the choice to keep it going, the choice to hide it, every single one was mine. I found myself wondering about the future. What did a man like me do now? How did I reconcile the person I wanted to be with the person I had shown myself to be? I realized that my life had been a series of layers, one covering the other, but I had never actually looked at the foundation. I was built on fear of abandonment, fear of being forgotten, fear of not being enough, and because I was so terrified of being left, I had left first. I had preemptively destroyed my own life so that I wouldn't have to wait for someone else to take it from me. It was a cowardly defensive maneuver, and it had worked exactly the way it was designed to. I was alone, and I had no one to blame but the man in the mirror. I went back to the house, and finally for the first time I turned off my phone. I didn't just mute it. I powered it down, pulling the life out of the device that had been the portal to my ruin. The silence in the house didn't get any louder. It just became permanent. I sat in the dark, and for the first time I didn't reach for a distraction. I didn't reach for a memory. I just sat with the reality of my actions. I had lost the love of my life, the woman who had built a future with me, and I had deserved every bit of the pain that was coming my way. I was a man who had everything, and I had traded it for the ghost of a girl I hadn't loved in a decade. The quiet of the house wasn't just physical anymore. It had seeped into my bones, a kind of existential frost that wouldn't thaw. I spent my days moving through the rooms like a man walking through his own funeral, observing the remnants of a life I was no longer authorized to lead. Her clothes were gone from the closet, leaving behind nothing but the empty hanger's gaunt silver skeletons, swaying in the draft whenever I opened the door. Her favorite books were gone from the shelf, and the space they left behind looked like a missing tooth in a smile. Every square inch of that house was screaming the truth at me. I had traded a living, breathing, beautiful reality for a handful of digital dust, and now the house was just a shell. I started to think about the nature of regret. Most people think regret is just a feeling of sadness, but that's not it at all. Regret is the agonizing minute-by-minute realization of every single choice you could have made differently. It's the phantom limb of your own life. Every time I reached for my coffee, I remembered the way she would have been there, the way the sunlight would have caught her hair, the way we would have shared the morning. And every time that memory hit, it was followed by the sharp stinging slap of the truth. You did this. You are the reason the coffee is cold. You are the reason the seat is empty. You are the reason she is out there somewhere trying to mend a heart that you were the one to break. I remember thinking about the first love dynamic that had triggered this entire disaster. We all have that one person, the one who represents our youth, our unblemished potential, the time before the world made us cynical. But the trap, the absolute soul-crushing trap, is believing that you can go back to that version of yourself. You can't. You are not that person anymore. You are a composite of every mistake you've ever made, every heartache you've ever survived, and every lesson you've ever failed to learn. By reaching back for Sarah, I wasn't trying to reclaim love. I was trying to reclaim an innocence that I had already forfeited years ago. And that's the tragedy, isn't it? We spend our lives running from the present, convinced that the answers are hidden in the past or waiting in some distant, idealized future. We stop looking at the person right in front of us. We take their devotion for granted, assuming it's a constant, a baseline we don't have to work to maintain. I treated Elena's love like a resource that would never run out, never realizing that love is a fire. If you don't feed it, if you treat it with contempt, if you starve it of honesty, it eventually dies. And once it's dead, you can't just strike a match and expect it to burn with the same intensity. One afternoon, I was walking through the park watching the leaves turn, and I saw an older couple holding hands, their skin mapped with the wrinkles of a lifetime. They weren't looking at phones. They weren't looking at ghosts. They were just looking at each other, their movements synced by years of shared experience and mutual radical trust. That was the dream. That was the goal. And I had been on that path. I had been building that with Elena. We were planting the seeds for our own old age, our own history, and I had pulled them all up by the roots just to see if the soil was still fertile for a weed from my past. The shame was so thick I could taste it. It was like copper in the back of my throat. I wondered if she ever thought about me or if she had managed to wipe me from her mind entirely. I hoped she had. I hoped she found someone who knew exactly what they had in her. Someone who wouldn't spend a single second wondering if the past was calling. She deserved that. She deserved a man who was entirely hers. A man who didn't carry a secret map to another life in his pocket. I was a man who had built a cage for himself and now the door was locked from the outside. I wasn't just suffering from the loss of my wife. I was suffering from the loss of my own moral standing. I had looked at my own reflection and hated what I saw. I had lied, I had hidden, I had manipulated, and I had been the architect of my own ruin. There was no moving on until I could forgive myself, and I realized with a terrifying clarity that I didn't deserve to be forgiven. Not yet. Maybe not ever. I had to sit in this. I had to feel the weight of it because that was the only way to ensure that I would never ever be this person again. If I walked away from this lesson, if I let myself off the hook, I would just be waiting for the next ghost to come calling. And that was a fate worse than being alone. I sat on a park bench and watched the sun dip below the skyline, casting long bruised shadows across the grass. I wasn't waiting for her to come back. I wasn't waiting for a miracle. I was just learning how to exist in the world as a man who had made the biggest mistake of his life and was now forced to live with the consequences. It was a cold, hard, and necessary truth. I had wanted the thrill of the past, and I had gotten it. I had been reminded of exactly who I was, and the reminder had cost me everything I had ever loved. I had spent years trying to outrun the ghost of my past, believing that if I moved far enough, loved hard enough, and built a life solid enough, the past would simply stop reaching for me. But as I sat in the silent, echoing living room of the home I had effectively turned into a museum of my own failures, I realized the mistake wasn't the move or the distance. The mistake was thinking I had ever actually let go of the boy I used to be. Sarah wasn't the problem. The problem was the unresolved aching void inside of me that always needed to feel like the protagonist of a tragic romantic epic. I'd lived my life like a character in a movie, always waiting for the next dramatic turn, the next what if, the next grand realization. But real life isn't a script. It's the boring, steady, beautiful work of showing up for the person next to you day in and day out, especially when there's no drama, no excitement, and no validation to be found. I had taken the most reliable, genuine, and tender love I had ever known Elena's love, and I had thrown it into the fire of my own ego. Every time she had looked at me with those trusting, searching eyes, I had been hiding a secret. I had been feeding an ego that demanded to be seen, to be desired, to be the one that got away. The weight of it was suffocating. I couldn't stop thinking about the way she used to look at me before the messages started. There was a softness, a sense of safety, an unspoken agreement that we were a team. I had broken that agreement in a heartbeat. I'd let a notification from a woman who had dumped me years ago dismantle everything we had built. And the worst part The truly gut-wrenching part, I knew deep down that if I had the chance to go back and do it all again, I wouldn't even have to think about it. I wouldn't just ignore the message. I would have deleted it the second I saw her name. I would have looked at Elena, realized the treasure I was holding, and never let the past take a single step into our sanctuary. But I didn't. I made the choice. I opened the door, I let the ghost in, and now I had to live with the fact that I was the one who had written this ending. I was the one who had caused the silence. I was the one who had caused the pain. I was the one who had turned a home into a graveyard. The nights grew longer and the days grew colder, and I found myself living in a constant dull ache of self-loathing that wouldn't lift. I wasn't waiting for her to call. I knew she wouldn't. I had given her every reason to walk away and not look back, and in my own strange twisted way I respected her for it. She was the one who had finally done what I had been too weak to do. She had cut the cord. I started to wonder if this was a necessary step in becoming a real human being. Maybe to stop being the boy who couldn't taste food after a breakup, I had to be the man who lost everything because he was too immature to protect it. It was a brutal lesson, a scorched earth policy of the heart, but it was a lesson I had clearly needed. I had to learn that trust isn't a commodity you can hoard. It's a living thing that needs to be earned constantly, and that once it's shattered, you can't just sweep the glass into a pile and hope it mends itself. Sometimes I'd see a text on my phone from a friend or a coworker, and my heart would leap just for a split second, a reflex of hope thinking it might be her. And then the reality would hit like a brick to the chest. It wasn't her. It would never be her. And that realization was the anchor that kept me grounded in the mess I had made. I deserved the emptiness, I deserved the silence, because I had chosen the ghost, and in doing so, I had lost the life I actually deserved to have. The days continued to bleed into one another, each one a carbon copy of the last, a bleak gray sequence of waking up to the hollow echo of a house that had forgotten how to be a home. I found myself obsessing over the small, seemingly insignificant details of our life before the bomb went off. I'd walk into the living room and see the exact spot on the couch where she used to curl up with a book, her feet tucked under her, and I'd be hit with a phantom sensation of her weight against my side. I would catch myself reaching out to hold her hand in the dark, only to find nothing but cold, empty air. The grief wasn't just an emotion, it was a physical intruder, a constant presence that sat at the dinner table with me and slept on the empty side of the bed. I started to understand with a clarity that felt like a surgical incision that my entire life had been defined by a need to be validated by people who had already left. My relationship with Sarah had been a toxic loop of I'm not good enough, so I need you to tell me I am. And when she broke off her engagement and messaged me she wasn't looking for a partner, she was looking for a mirror. She wanted to see if I was still the same pathetic, lovesick boy who couldn't eat for a year without her. And I had been that boy. I had allowed myself to be cast in the role of the backup plan, the what if, the sentimental souvenir of a life she had discarded years ago. The irony was that in trying to prove I was over the past, I had actually been its prisoner the entire time. Elena had been my salvation, a woman who loved me not because of what I had been, but because of who I was with her. She was my chance to be a man, to be an adult, to be a partner. And I had thrown that salvation away for a digital ghost. I hadn't just insulted Elena, I had insulted the very concept of growth. I had taken the most beautiful, healthy connection of my life and effectively told it, you're not as interesting as a memory. I started to go to the coffee shop where we used to have our Saturday mornings. I'd sit there for hours watching the door, half expecting to see her walk in, her face bright with that familiar, genuine smile. And when the door would open, and it was always someone else, a stranger, a friend, anyone but her, the disappointment would settle into my bones like lead. I deserved this. I deserved the silence. I deserved the emptiness. Because when you play a dangerous game with someone's trust, when you decide that your own ego and your own curiosity are more important than the sacred bond of marriage, you lose the right to expect anything else. I began to realize that I wasn't waiting for her to come back. I was waiting for the person I used to be to finally die. I was waiting for that insecure validation seeking drama-hungry version of me to be completely burned out by the pain of this loss. I wanted to be the kind of man who didn't need to look over his shoulder, who didn't need to check his notifications for the approval of a ghost, who could simply be present. But I knew that transformation wouldn't come from a quick fix or a clever apology. It would come from the long, agonizing, solitary walk through the ruins of my own choices. I remember the day I finally took our wedding photos off the wall. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely hold the frames. I looked at the man in those photos, the guy who was smiling, who looked like he had the whole world in front of him, and I didn't recognize him. I was looking at a man who was walking toward a cliff, completely unaware of the drop. I put those photos into a box, sealed it with packing tape, and put it in the back of the closet. Not because I wanted to hide from the pain, but because I needed to acknowledge that the life those photos captured was finished. I was officially a man who had lost his marriage, his best friend, and his future, all because he couldn't let go of a dead, rotting memory. I had the first love I had always dreamed of, and it turned out to be the exact thing that destroyed my real life. I sat on the floor of that closet, the box in my lap, and I finally allowed myself to cry. Not for Sarah. Not for the what if. I cried for Elena. I cried for the woman I had hurt so deeply, the woman who had trusted me with her life and her love, and whom I had rewarded with the deepest betrayal a partner can suffer. I had been told at the very beginning of all this that I deserved what happened. And for the first time, I finally agreed. I didn't just accept it, I owned it. I was the architect, the builder, and the demolition crew of my own ruin. I was standing in the wreckage, and I knew that there was no going back to the way things were. The ghost was gone, my wife was gone, and the house was just a space waiting for a new story. A story that I, and only I, was responsible for writing if I could ever figure out who I was meant to be now that the illusions had finally been stripped away. The silence that settled into my life wasn't just a quiet house, it was a profound, suffocating realization that I had spent years running away from the one thing that could actually save me myself. I had spent so long from my early 20s to my 30s tethered to the idea of Sarah, to the idea of a lost cinematic love, that I never actually learned how to be a complete person on my own. When she left, I withered. When I met Elena, I leaned on her like a crutch. I hadn't built a life with her. I had built a life around her, using her warmth to hide the fact that I was still empty inside. I realized that the reason I opened that message, the reason I let that door crack open, was because I was terrified of being just a man in a marriage. I was terrified of the quiet, beautiful consistency of a real adult relationship. I wanted the drama. I wanted the validation. I wanted the what if, because it made me feel like the hero of a tragic romantic story rather than just a guy who had to figure out how to be a better person. It was the ultimate shallow indulgence. I traded a diamond for a piece of glass just because the glass shimmered a little bit brighter under the stage lights of my own ego. I remember sitting in that empty kitchen, looking at the spot where she used to stand while she made coffee in the mornings. I would replay the moments where I had been cold, where I had been distracted, where I had been there physically but light years away mentally. I saw it all now, the little dismissals, the way I wouldn't quite meet her eyes, the way I would quickly turn my phone face down when she entered the room. I thought I was being subtle. I thought I was protecting her. But she wasn't blind. She had been living with a man who was drifting away, and she had been waiting for the moment when I would finally, undeniably, break her heart. And I did. I broke it completely. I started to read books not for entertainment but for an autopsy of my own personality. I looked into the psychology of attachment, of trauma, of why we chase ghosts. It wasn't groundbreaking, but it was horrifying. I was a textbook case of someone who couldn't find self-worth in the present because I was too busy mourning a past that had never truly existed in the way I remembered it. Sarah wasn't my soulmate. She was a trigger. She was a reminder of the time I felt the most alive because I had no responsibilities, no stability, and no real future to worry about. I was mourning the lack of consequences in my youth, and I had destroyed my adult life to try to get back to that feeling. The irony was that in trying to be the hero, I had become the villain. I had done the one thing I promised I would never do. I had become a liar. I had become the kind of man I used to despise. I was the guy who kept secrets, who flirted on the side, who treated his partner like an option rather than a priority. And the worst part was that I didn't even have the excuse of being a bad person. I was just a weak person. I was a man who couldn't handle the weight of his own integrity when the temptation of his own ego appeared on a screen. I started to reach out to a therapist, someone who could help me navigate the wreckage. Those sessions were like pulling teeth. Every hour I spent in that office, I was forced to face a new, uglier version of myself. I had to admit that I didn't deserve Elena back, not because I didn't love her, but because I hadn't earned the right to have her in my life. I had violated the most fundamental pact of our relationship, and no amount of "I'm sorry" would ever be enough to fix a broken foundation. I wasn't just losing her. I was losing the dream of who I thought I was. I stopped blaming Sarah. I stopped blaming the circumstances of my first breakup. I took full, absolute ownership of the chaos. I was the one who hit send. I was the one who kept the conversation going. I was the one who waited until I was caught or until I was too panicked to keep the secret any longer. I was the one who had brought a ghost into our home, and because I was the one who brought it in, I was the one who had to live with the consequences of it haunting every single corner of my existence. The house was still full of her things, but they were packed now. She had come by with her brother to pick up the last of it, and we hadn't said a word. She looked at me once, just once, and there was no anger left. That was the most painful part. There was only pity. She didn't hate me, she just saw me for exactly what I was, a man who had lost his way and taken her down with him. She walked out that door, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel the urge to follow. I just stood there, watching the dust motes dance in the light, and realized that I was finally, truly, and completely alone. And for the first time, I knew I had to be. I remember the exact moment the last box was carried out the door. It wasn't a loud crashing sound like in a movie. It was the quiet, hollow thud of a cardboard bottom hitting the floorboards of the porch. When she walked away, she didn't even glance back. She didn't need to. She had already left me weeks before the moment she realized she was sharing her bed with a stranger who was mentally thousands of miles away, chasing the ghost of a girl who had forgotten he existed a long time ago. I stood in the doorway, the air hitting me like a physical weight. The house was finally empty. Not just empty of furniture, but empty of the life we had carefully constructed over those years. I had treated our marriage as a safety net, something that would catch me, no matter how recklessly I behaved, but I had learned the hard way that a safety net is only as strong as the person holding it. And when that person stops believing in you, the net doesn't just sag, it disintegrates. The following weeks were a brutal, unfiltered education in solitude. I stopped trying to pretend I was okay. I stopped trying to fix the house or make it look like someone lived there. I let the silence be. I let the dust settle. I spent my evenings sitting in the dark, not looking at my phone, not reaching for a distraction, just sitting with the version of myself that I had worked so hard to hide. I was a man who had chosen the what if over the what is, and I had paid the ultimate price. I've had a lot of time to think about the people who reach out to their first loves. We see it on the internet all the time, the stories of people reconnecting, the romanticized versions of second chances. But those stories almost always leave out the wreckage. They leave out the spouses, the partners, the families that get caught in the blast radius of someone else's midlife nostalgia. I was that wreckage. I was the person who decided that my own curiosity was more important than the sacred, quiet, daily commitment of being a husband. People ask me now when they hear the story, why didn't you just tell her sooner? Or why didn't you just block Sarah the moment she messaged? And the answer is the most painful thing I have to admit to myself. I wanted to be wanted. I was a grown man, a husband, and a professional, yet I was still operating on the insecure wiring of my teenage self. I needed to know that someone from my past still found me attractive, still found me enough. And in seeking that validation, I proved that I was the exact opposite of what I was looking for. I was small, I was weak, and I was selfish. I've started to rebuild, but not in the way you might think. I'm not moving on to a new relationship. I'm not jumping back into the dating pool to prove I'm still desirable. I'm doing the work that I should have done a decade ago. I'm learning how to be alone. I'm learning that a life worth living isn't defined by the people who validate you, but by the integrity you maintain when you're standing in a room by yourself with nothing but your own thoughts for company. I look back at the messages. Now I finally deleted them permanently, the entire history gone, and I see them for what they were, a test I failed. Sarah didn't ruin my marriage. She was just the catalyst. She was the match, but I was the pile of gasoline that had been sitting there waiting to be lit for years. I had built my marriage on a foundation of unresolved grief and a need for external approval, and it was only a matter of time before somebody came along to shake it. If there is anyone listening who is in the middle of this, who is just talking to an ex, who is just keeping the door ajar because of some unhealed wound from the past, let me tell you this. You are playing a game you cannot win. You are not protecting your future, you are actively dismantling it. You are trading a real living, breathing person for a ghost that doesn't care if you burn your house down as long as they get a little bit of attention. It is not worth it. It is never worth it. I have lost the woman who was my world, the woman who deserved better than a man who was looking for a ghost. And while I'll never get her back, and I know I don't deserve to, I hope that by sharing this, by owning every single ugly, shameful detail of my betrayal, I can save someone else from the same hollow ending. Because trust me, the silence that follows is a lot heavier than the thrill of the what if ever was. The weight of what I've lost is not something you just get over like a bad flu or a difficult week at work. It is a permanent fixture in the landscape of my life now. It's like a limb I've had to amputate. Every morning, I wake up, and for a fleeting, beautiful half second, my mind is still back in the days when Elena was there, the way she would stir in her sleep, the soft rhythm of her breathing, the warmth of her hand against mine. Then the reality rushes in cold and absolute, and I'm hit with the realization that I am the sole author of this loneliness. I didn't just lose a wife, I lost the person who truly knew me, the person who saw the best in me, even when I was at my worst, and I threw it away for a digital ghost who was nothing more than a vanity mirror. People like to tell you that mistakes happen, that we are all human, that we all have our weak moments, but that's a dangerous lie. It's a way of letting ourselves off the hook so we don't have to face the true ugly nature of what we did. I didn't make a mistake. I made a series of conscious, deliberate choices. I chose to click on the request. I chose to reply. I chose to hide the conversation. I chose to keep feeding the flames of an old dead fire because I was addicted to the feeling of being wanted by someone who had once rejected me. That's not a mistake. That's a fundamental character flaw, and I've had to spend months staring at that flaw until my eyes burned. I have spent a long time thinking about what I would say to her if I could not, to beg for her back, because I know that door is welded shut, but to give her the clarity she deserves. She was a woman who gave her whole heart to a man she believed in, and I spent my energy wondering if the girl who dumped me years ago still found me interesting. It's humiliating. It's the kind of thing you look back on and wonder, what was I thinking? Why was I so small? The only answer is that I hadn't grown up. I had reached a certain age, I had a career, I had a mortgage, but internally I was still that 19-year-old kid who couldn't eat for a year because he felt discarded. I've come to realize that the most important thing a person can do for their partner is to be fully present. Not just physically, but emotionally. When you are constantly looking backward, you are stealing from the person standing right in front of you. You are robbing them of the undivided attention and love they are entitled to. And when you let someone else in, even if it's just through a screen, you are effectively cheating on your own life. You are deciding that your own ego is more important than the sacred trust of your marriage. I see the comments sometimes and people talk about how everyone has an ex they wonder about. And maybe that's true. Maybe it's a human impulse to wonder about the roads not taken. But there is a massive cavernous difference between wondering what if and actively inviting the past into your bedroom. I invited it in. I laid out the welcome mat, I poured the drinks, and I waited for the ghost to arrive, never once stopping to think that I was the one who was going to be left in the dark when the light finally went out. I am a man who has had to learn to live with his own shadow. I don't look for validation anymore. I don't need a notification to tell me I'm relevant. I am learning to find value in the things I do for myself, in the work I put into my own character, and in the quiet of a life that I am finally truly building on my own terms. It's not a glamorous life. There are no dramatic what-ifs left to chase, but it is mine. It is honest, and for the first time, it is not built on the shifting sand of a past that never really existed. I know I'll never be able to reach out to Elena and tell her this. I know that for her, I am a chapter that has been torn out of her book, and I accept that. I have to. Because if I truly loved her, which I like to believe I did in my own flawed, selfish way, then I have to respect her right to be free of the man who broke her trust. I hope she finds someone who knows what it means to be a husband, someone who understands that the only what if that matters is the one you are writing every single day with the person you chose to walk through life with. I'm sharing this because I know there are others out there who are doing exactly what I did. Just a little bit of texting, just a little bit of harmless reminiscing, just a little bit of seeing how they're doing. Stop it. If you value your relationship, if you value the person you've built a life with, cut the cord before the fire spreads. Because once it spreads, there is no amount of water you can pour on it that will save your home. You will be standing in the ashes wondering how you were ever foolish enough to hold the match in the first place. I look back at that house now at the memories of the rooms where we once shared coffee, where we planned our future, where we built a life that seemed so indestructible, and I realize that the structure wasn't as solid as I had let myself believe. The walls were standing, the roof was sound, but the foundation was resting on a fault line of my own making. I had been living with a ghost in the guest room of my own mind for years, and when Sarah finally walked through the digital door I'd left unlatched, she didn't just walk into my life. She walked into the living room of my marriage and set the curtains on fire. And the truly pathetic thing, the thing that keeps me awake at night even now, is that I watched it burn. I watched it, I felt the heat, and I did nothing to stop it until the roof was already caving in. There is a particular kind of silence that follows a betrayal. One that isn't just an absence of sound, but a physical weight, a dense and suffocating atmosphere that hangs in the air and settles into the upholstery. It's the silence of a life that has been rendered invalid. Every object I own, every book on the shelf, every dish in the cabinet, it all feels like a relic from a civilization that has been wiped out. I am the only survivor, and yet I am the one who caused the extinction. I have to live with the knowledge that there is a version of me that existed before a man who was capable of deep, sincere, and unshakable devotion. And I have to reconcile that man with the one who sabotaged it all for a few weeks of ego-stroking texts. I've spent these last few months trying to strip away the artifice. I've stopped trying to dress up my actions in the language of misunderstanding or lapse in judgment. I was a grown man who knew exactly what he was doing. I was playing a game of emotional roulette, and I was betting with the only currency that actually mattered, my wife's trust. And when the wheel stopped, I didn't lose money. I lost my dignity. I lost the ability to look at myself in the mirror without feeling a flicker of disgust. I've realized that the greatest tragedy of my life isn't that I lost Elena, though that grief is a constant dull throb. It's that I lost the person I was when I was with her. I killed him. I smothered him with the shroud of my own past. I think about the people who say that time heals all wounds, but they never talk about the scarring. The scars don't disappear, they just become part of your map. They are the landmarks of where you went wrong, the warning signs for the next time you find yourself standing at a crossroads. I've spent my time learning to read these new scars. I've learned that my need for validation was a symptom, not a personality trait. I've learned that my attachment to Sarah was never about love. It was about the fear of being forgotten, the fear that my life didn't have enough meaning unless someone from the before times was watching. How shallow is that? To need an audience for your existence, to need a ghost to prove that you're still relevant. I've started to look at the world differently. I notice couples now not with envy, but with a kind of profound, sober respect. When I see an old man holding his wife's hand, I don't see two people who are lucky enough to never have trials. I see two people who made 1,000 tiny, deliberate, conscious choices every single day to stay in the boat. They didn't steer for the rocks of nostalgia. They didn't leave the door open for the past. They committed to the present, and they protected it with everything they had. That is the labor of love, and it is a labor I had the privilege of performing, and one that I squandered because I was too lazy to do the work. If you're out there and you're feeling that itch, that curiosity about an ex, that urge to just see what they're up to, please take it from someone who has stood in the absolute incinerated wreckage of his own life. You are not just checking in, you are reaching for a bottle of poison and wondering if it tastes like wine. Stop, turn your phone off, walk into the other room, talk to the person you promised your life to, look at them, really look at them, and ask yourself if they are worth more than a digital memory. Because I promise you they are. They are everything. And once you trade that for the ghost, you don't get a refund. You don't get a do-over, you get the silence. And the silence is a heavy, permanent price to pay. The silence in this house is a living, breathing thing now. It doesn't just sit in the corners. It follows me from room to room, a constant reminder that I am the one who invited it in. I walk past the kitchen and I see the phantom shape of Elena, the way she used to lean against the island with a mug of tea, the way she would look up when I walked in, her face softening with a kind of quiet, steady joy that I had the privilege of being the sole witness to. I had that. I held that love in my hands and I treated it like a passing whim. I didn't see it as the anchor, I saw it as a restraint. That's the most damning truth I've had to face. I didn't appreciate the safety I had until I was drowning in the storm I invited. I've been reading back through the notes I've scribbled since she left, trying to find some semblance of growth, some reason to believe that I'm not just the same insecure, validation-starved boy I was 10 years ago. It's hard to find. Most of it is just a record of regret, a tally of the things I've destroyed. I've realized that I spent so long trying to be the guy who moved on that I never actually finished the process. I was a professional at looking like I had it all together, but underneath I was still the kid who couldn't taste food when his heart broke. I was still that boy, and the moment Sarah signaled that she was available, that boy took the wheel and he drove us straight off the cliff. I wonder sometimes if Elena ever thinks about me. I hope she doesn't. I hope she's found someone whose heart is entirely unequivocally in the room with her, someone who isn't hiding a secret map of their past in their back pocket. She deserves that kind of purity. She deserves the kind of love that isn't divided, the kind that doesn't wonder if the grass is greener on the other side of a decade-old text thread. She deserves someone who knows, without a shadow of a doubt, that she's the only person on earth who matters. I wasn't that man. I was the man who kept a back door unlocked, and that is a betrayal that no apology can ever touch. I've had people ask me, do you think you'll ever find love again? And I tell them the truth, that's not the goal right now. I'm not interested in finding anything. I'm interested in being the kind of person who is actually capable of keeping something beautiful when it finds me. I'm interested in building a life that doesn't need to be propped up by the approval of others. I'm interested in the kind of integrity that holds up under pressure, the kind that doesn't fold. The second an old ghost says, hello. I've had to learn that the hard way through the total absolute destruction of everything I cherished. There's a part of me, a small, pathetic, lingering part that still wants to say, but it was just a few messages. But then I look at the void where my marriage used to be, and I realize that the messages were just the tip of the iceberg. The real betrayal was the fact that I had allowed my heart to be divided for years. I had been living a lie, playing the part of a devoted husband, while harboring a secret longing for a version of myself that had died a long time ago. The marriage didn't die because of the messages, it died because I had been starving it for years, feeding my ego on the side, and eventually the truth was bound to come out. I'm sharing all of this raw, ugly, and humiliating reality because I want to challenge anyone who thinks they can flirt with the past while protecting their future. You can't. It's a physical impossibility. You are either moving toward the future you've chosen, or you are sliding backward into the comfort of a ghost. You cannot do both. I chose the slide, and I've paid the price. I'm a man who has lost his home, his partner, and his peace of mind, all because I was too weak to let go of a memory. If you are at that crossroads, if you are looking at that notification, if you are feeling the pull of the what if, don't do it. Block them. Turn it off. Look at the person sleeping next to you, or the life you've built, or the future you're working toward, and realize that it is more precious than any fleeting sense of validation a ghost can offer. I'm writing this from the wreckage, and the view is not something you want to see. I am the cautionary tale. I am the man who had it all and threw it away because he was too obsessed with the way things used to be. Don't be me. Choose the present, fight for it, protect it. Because once the silence starts, it never really goes away. The silence in my life has become a teacher. It doesn't offer comfort or solace, but it demands an honesty I was never capable of before. I find myself looking at my phone, the screen dark and silent, and I realize it no longer holds the power to break me. I don't check for notifications from the past. I don't look for the digital validation that once acted as a slow-acting poison in my veins. I am finally, for the first time in my adult life, standing on my own 2 feet without leaning on the memory of someone who didn't actually want me. I've begun to understand the anatomy of my own betrayal. It wasn't about Sarah. It wasn't about our past or the what could have been. It was entirely about my own refusal to inhabit the life I had chosen. I treated Elena the most patient, loving, and real person I've ever known, like a temporary solution to the hole in my chest. I thought I was over the heartbreak of my youth, but I had only built a facade of recovery. Every time I looked at Elena, I wasn't seeing a partner. I was seeing a safety net that I was convinced would never fail. I was arrogant, I was careless, and I was fundamentally ungrateful. When I talk about the wreckage, I'm not just talking about the house, or the legal papers, or the way my friends look at me now, those who know what I did. I'm talking about the erosion of my own soul. I had to watch myself lie to the woman I promised to protect. I had to experience the nausea of hiding a secret while she was being vulnerable with me. I had to witness the moment her face went cold, the moment she realized she was living with a man who was emotionally cheating on her every single day. That memory is not something I can ever get over. It is the anchor that keeps me grounded in the reality of what I've done. I see people online in forums, in comments talking about how they're just friends with their exes, how they've moved on, and can keep that door open. Maybe for some people that works. But for me, for a man who didn't even know his own heart, who was using the past to escape the present, it was a disaster waiting to happen. I had no boundaries because I had no self-respect. I was addicted to the feeling of being special to someone from my past, even though that past was a graveyard. I often find myself wondering what my life would look like right now if I had just blocked Sarah the moment she reached out. I see a version of myself where I'm sitting at the dinner table with Elena, talking about our plans for the weekend, about the future, about the simple, boring, beautiful things that define a real marriage. And then I snap back to the current reality, the empty chairs, the quiet house, the long nights spent in a guest room that feels like a prison. The contrast is devastating. It's the difference between a life of substance and a life of shadow. I chose the shadow, I reached for the ghost, and in doing so, I became one myself. But there is a strange cold comfort in finally seeing the truth. I can no longer hide behind excuses. I can no longer pretend that I was confused or caught off guard. I am a man who knowingly chose to destroy his own life, and the only path forward is to carry that weight until it shapes me into something different. I am not looking for redemption. I am looking for reality. I am looking for the version of myself that can exist in the world without needing to be the guy who gets the girl or the guy who stays in touch with his first love. I just want to be a man who knows what he has while he still has it. If you're listening to this and you're in the position I was in, if you're holding onto a thread from the past while trying to build a future, let go. Cut it. The thread isn't holding you up, it's pulling you down. It's dragging you into the same darkness I'm currently living in. You don't need the closure, you don't need the updates, and you certainly don't need the what if. You need the person who is actually in your life, the one who is investing in you, the one who is building with you. Protect them. Treat them like the miracle they are, because once they're gone, no amount of wishing or regretting will ever bring them back. I'm proof of that. The silence is permanent, the loss is real, and the only thing left to do is to learn from the ruins. The silence in this house has become more than just an absence of noise. It is the most honest conversation I have ever had with myself. For the first time in my life, there is no one else to blame, no circumstances to point to, and no first love to romanticize. The ghosts have all been cleared out, and in their place, there is only the brutal, unforgiving light of reality. I sit in the living room in the quiet of the evening, and I think about the man I was before I opened that message, the man who thought he had everything, the man who was so incredibly dangerously ungrateful for the life he had built. I find myself replaying the moment she packed her bags. It wasn't the sound of her leaving that haunts me most, it was the look on her face. It was the look of a woman who had finally stopped waiting for me to be the person she needed, a woman who had realized that my heart was not and had never been fully in our house. She looked at me with such profound, exhausted clarity that I felt like a child who had been caught playing with a dangerous toy. She wasn't just walking out of the house, she was walking out of the delusion. And I had left her with no choice. I had painted her into a corner where her only act of self-respect was to leave. Sometimes I think about reaching out just to say I'm sorry one last time, to explain that I finally understand the gravity of what I did. But then I stop. I stop because I realize that any message I send would be for me, not for her. It would be an attempt to clear my own conscience, to find a way to make myself feel less like the villain of our story. And she doesn't owe me that. She doesn't owe me a moment of her time or a scrap of her forgiveness. She gave me her best years, her trust, and her heart, and I gave her back the shadow of a woman who had forgotten me a decade ago. I have to live with that. I have to carry that debt forever. I've started to look at my life as a series of lessons, each one harder than the last. I learned that trust is a fragile crystalline thing. It takes years to grow, but only a few careless weeks to shatter. I learned that first love is a myth we tell ourselves to feel like we're the heroes of a grand tragic romance. But in reality, it's just a developmental milestone we're supposed to outgrow, not a destination we're meant to return to. And most importantly, I learned that if you don't value the person who is sitting across from you, the person who chooses you every day, you don't deserve the life you've been given. I wonder sometimes if I'll ever be able to trust myself again. I don't mean trusting myself to stay away from an ex that's easy now because the desire is dead. I mean trusting myself to be a man who doesn't need to look for validation in the shadows. I'm learning slowly that being a whole person means being comfortable in your own skin without needing anyone past or present to reflect your value back to you. It's a lonely path, but it's the only one that leads away from the wreckage. I'm no longer the man who is running from his past, and I'm no longer the man who is using his marriage as a sanctuary he didn't appreciate. I'm just a man who is finally painfully learning how to be real. If you're out there and you're feeling that familiar pull toward the past, that flicker of curiosity that feels like a harmless bit of fun, take a hard look at the life you have right now. Really look at it. Look at the person who loves you. Look at the history you've built, the promises you've made and the future you're working toward. Then ask yourself, is a digital connection with a ghost worth the total absolute annihilation of all of that? Because that is the trade you're making. You're trading your reality for a fantasy, and the cost is everything. I am not the same person I was when I wrote that first post. I have lost my wife, my home, and the life I thought was guaranteed to me. But I have found something else, something I never wanted, and certainly never asked for the truth about who I am. It's not a pretty picture. It's a portrait of a man who is insecure, immature, and fundamentally broken. But it is the truth. And until you face your own truth, you can never change. I am living in the aftermath of my own choices, and while I wouldn't wish this silence on anyone, I know that it is the only place where I could finally grow up. The reality of the life I've been living lately, this quiet, gray, solitary existence, is something I never could have imagined when I was first texting Sarah. Back then, I thought I was in control. I thought I was just chatting, just finding closure, just seeing how things were. It's the ultimate dangerous vanity to believe you can walk along the edge of a cliff without eventually losing your footing. I wasn't just walking. I was dancing on the edge of my own destruction, and I had absolutely no idea how deep the drop actually was. Now I know. I've hit the bottom. And the view from down here isn't the romantic tragedy I once thought it would be. It's just cold, and it's quiet, and it's permanent. I look at the space where our life used to be, and I realize that the most painful thing isn't the loss of the big moments, the anniversaries, the holidays, the plans we made for the future. It's the loss of the mundane. It's the quiet Tuesday night when we would have been watching a show, or the Sunday morning when we would have gone for a walk. Those are the moments that have been hollowed out. They are the daily, consistent reminders that I had a treasure and I traded it for a handful of digital dust. I let a ghost from a decade ago walk into our house and shatter the foundation, and I'm the only one left to sweep up the shards. I've had to learn that forgiveness isn't a gift you give to yourself. It's not a magic pill that makes the guilt go away. I don't think I can ever truly forgive myself for what I did to Elena. She was the best thing that ever happened to me, and I was the one who decided she wasn't enough. How do you recover from that knowledge? How do you look at yourself in the mirror every morning and not see the man who betrayed the only person who ever truly believed in him? You don't. You just learn to live with the reflection knowing that it's the price of admission for the lesson. If there's anyone listening who is currently in the middle of a just talking phase with an ex, or someone who is justifying why it's not really cheating, please listen to me. You are lying to yourself in a way that will destroy you. You are building a house of cards in the middle of a hurricane and you are waiting for the wind to blow. My marriage didn't die because of a grand dramatic affair. It died because I was disrespectful, because I was ungrateful, and because I valued my own ego above the sanctity of the promise I had made to the woman I loved. That's the real tragedy. It wasn't a sudden explosion. It was a slow, deliberate rot that I facilitated every single day. I don't know what the future holds, and quite honestly, I'm not sure I deserve to know. I'm just trying to get through the days one at a time, trying to find a version of myself that doesn't need to look backward to feel significant. I'm learning that the most profound act of love isn't the what if, it's the what is. It's the commitment to the person who is actually there, the one who is holding your hand when you're scared, the one who is sharing your life, the one who is building the future with you. If you have that, you have everything. If you don't, no amount of ghost hunting in the past will ever make you whole. So if you're at that crossroads, make the right choice. Choose your partner. Choose your reality. Choose the work and the honesty and the integrity of the life you've built together. Block the ghost. Delete the thread. And for the love of everything you hold dear, cherish the person who is actually in your life before you're the one left sitting in an empty house, wondering how you were ever foolish enough to hold the match that burned it all down. Because once the silence starts, you realize that all the what-ifs in the world don't add up to a single moment with the person you actually loved. Don't throw your treasure away. I did, and I have to live in the silence that followed. The silence in this house has become more than just a lack of conversation. It is the most honest teacher I've ever had. I sit here in the evenings watching the shadows stretch across the empty floor, and I realize that for the first time in my adult life, I am not trying to be a character in someone else's story. I'm not trying to be the tragic hero of a lost romance, and I'm not trying to be the perfect husband who never makes mistakes. I am just a man who has finally stopped lying to himself. And let me tell you, that realization that I was the one who kept the door cracked open for a ghost is a truth that burns. I find myself thinking about the messages, the ones I once thought were just harmless curiosity. Looking back now, the content doesn't even matter. It wasn't about the specific words or the timeline of her breakup. It was about the fact that I allowed a third party to enter the sanctity of my marriage. I gave Sarah the power to compete with my wife. I gave her the right to take up space in my thoughts, space that belonged entirely to Elena. That in itself was the betrayal. It wasn't the what of the messages, it was the why. I wanted to feel special to someone from the past, and I sacrificed the one person who actually made me feel special every single day. If you are currently in a situation where you feel that itch, where you find yourself reaching for the phone to check in on an ex, please understand the gravity of what you are doing. You aren't just sending a message. You are sending a signal that the life you currently have is not enough. And the moment that signal is sent, the foundation of your relationship begins to crack. It is a slow, quiet, insidious process. You might think you're being careful, you might think you're being discreet, but you are creating a divide that eventually will become a canyon. And once that canyon opens, it doesn't matter how much you try to bridge it, the trust is gone. I've had to learn to live with the regret, and it is a heavy, unrelenting burden. I've had to accept that there is no magical apology, no grand gesture that can undo the damage I caused. Elena is gone, and she is right to be gone. She deserves a partner who doesn't look over his shoulder, someone who doesn't keep a secret file of what-ifs in his heart. I have to accept that I am no longer that person for her, and that I may never be that person for anyone else. I have to sit in this emptiness and realize that I created it, and that this is the final, irrevocable consequence of choosing a ghost over a reality. I'm sharing this because I know that my story isn't unique. I know there are countless others out there who are currently walking the same path I walked, convinced that they are the exception, convinced that they can handle the past without hurting their future. You aren't the exception. You are just as human, just as flawed, and just as capable of sabotaging your own happiness as I was. Do not wait for the silence to find you. Do not wait for the house to be empty. Choose your partner today. Choose the person who loves you for who you are now, not who you were back then. I hope that by being this open, by laying bare the absolute humiliating ruin of my own marriage, I can reach someone who is standing right where I was, at the very beginning of the end. Choose to be better than I was. Choose to protect your relationship with the ferocity it deserves. Choose to delete the messages, block the contact, and pour every ounce of your energy into the life you are actually living. Because I can tell you from the bottom of this quiet, empty house, there is nothing in the past worth losing your future for. The ghost has no power unless you give it to them. Don't give it to them. Keep your home safe. Keep your heart where it belongs. And please, for the sake of your own happiness, do not throw away your treasure for the sake of a memory. The weight of the silence in this house has shifted from being a crushing burden to being a profound necessary mirror. I sit in the dim light of the living room, the room where I once stood, and tried to justify my own betrayal, and I finally recognized the man I was. He wasn't a villain in a grand cinematic sense. He was something much smaller. He was a man who didn't know the value of what he had until he had personally dismantled it. I was a man who, despite having built a life with the woman I claimed to love, was still secretly starving for the validation of a girl who had long since moved on. It's a pathetic, hollow realization, but it is mine. I've had to face the fact that my marriage didn't die because of Sarah. Sarah was just a mirror, a reflection of my own deep-seated insecurity and my refusal to grow into the man Elena needed. If it hadn't been Sarah, it would have been someone else. It would have been some other unfinished business, some other excuse to look away from the person who is actually standing in front of me. I was a man looking for an exit strategy, and I didn't even realize I was doing it until the door was already wide open and everything I loved had walked out. I see the life I had, the mornings, the shared plans, the quiet laughter, and I realize now that it wasn't a given. It was a privilege. Every day that Elena woke up and chose to be with me was a gift that I treated like a baseline expectation. I assumed her love was a constant, a reservoir I could dip into whenever I needed to feel better about myself while I pursued my own selfish interests on the side. That is the ultimate narcissism. I didn't see her as a partner. I saw her as an accessory to my own comfort, and when I realized that she was a person with her own dignity, her own boundaries, and her own heart, it was already too late. The hardest part of this journey, this long solitary crawl through the wreckage, has been letting go of the need for an ending that feels resolved. In a movie, there's a redemption arc. There's a scene where the man realizes his mistake, goes back, apologizes, and everything is forgiven. But this isn't a movie. It's real life. In real life, sometimes you burn the bridge and the only thing left to do is to stand on the shore and watch the smoke rise. I have to accept that I am the one who caused this and that there is no magical way to unbreak a heart that I have shattered. I have started to reach out in my own way to the only person I know who needs to hear this, the person who is currently playing with fire. I don't know who you are, but I know how you feel. You feel special because the ghost is texting you. You feel validated because they remembered you. You feel like you're just being nice. You are not. You are being a thief. You are stealing from your own future. You are stealing from your partner. And most importantly, you are stealing from your own character. You are becoming a person who keeps secrets, a person who divides their heart, a person who cannot be trusted. If you are at that threshold, if your finger is hovering over that notification, if you are wondering if it's really that big of a deal, stop. Close the app, delete the conversation, and then go find your partner, look them in the eye, and realize that you are holding the most precious thing you will ever possess. Don't trade it, don't gamble it, don't let your ego talk you into a ruin you will never be able to leave. I'm standing in the ruins now, and the silence is the only thing I have left. It's a cold, hard, and final place, but it's also the only place where I've finally stopped running. I've stopped chasing the ghost. I've stopped looking for validation in the past. I am just a man finally living in the present, even if that present is entirely empty. If my story keeps one person from making the mistake I made, if it keeps one house full of warmth instead of silence, and one heart safe instead of broken, then maybe this loss won't have been entirely for nothing. What would you do if you found yourself in a position where the past was calling out to you? Would you have the strength to walk away, or would you be tempted like I was to see what might happen? Let me know in the comments. And if you've ever had to walk through the fire of your own making, I want to hear how you survived it. Don't forget to subscribe if you want to hear more stories about the hard lessons life teaches us when we aren't paying attention. I'm just a man who lost it all, and if there's any wisdom to be found in the ashes, I hope it helps you build a life that's stronger than mine ever was. The silence that now defines my life is not just the absence of another person, it is the presence of everything I had and walked away from. I spend my evenings in the living room, a space that once vibrated with the simple domestic sounds of a life, shared the clinking of silverware, the murmur of a show playing in the background, the soft rustle of someone reading in the corner. Now the only sound is the hum of the refrigerator and the wind against the siding. It's a sensory deprivation that forces me to confront the scale of my own arrogance. I once thought that because I was technically just messaging, I hadn't actually committed a crime. But I realize now that the crime wasn't in the words I sent to Sarah. The crime was in the intentional repeated devaluation of the person who actually loved me. I think about the concept of the one who got away. It's such a seductive, dangerous idea. It implies that there is a soulmate out there who was lost due to bad timing or cruel fate, and that perhaps if we just find them again, our lives will finally click into place. But it's a lie. It's a fantasy that ignores the reality of why people drift apart in the first place. Sarah and I didn't drift apart because of circumstances. We grew apart because we were different people. My insistence on holding onto that phantom idea of us was never about her. It was about my own refusal to accept that I had changed, that I had grown, and that the person I had become required a different kind of love than the one I had at 19. I look at the life I've built since the collapse, the job, the quiet routine, the solitary meals, and I realize that I am essentially living in the penance I created for myself. There is no joy in it, but there is clarity. I've stopped trying to look for a shortcut to happiness. I've stopped trying to find a person to anchor me because I know now that an anchor is useless if the person holding it is trying to sail in a different direction. I have to be my own anchor. I have to be the person who is honest, the person who doesn't hide his phone, the person who doesn't need a ghost to validate his existence. The hardest thing for me to accept is that Elena is moving on. I don't know where she is or who she's with or if she still thinks about the man I used to be. And the truth is, I don't have the right to know. I burned that privilege when I decided that a DM from the past was worth more than her peace of mind. I hope she finds someone who is entirely present, someone whose heart is not a divided house, and someone who understands that the most important thing you can ever give to another person is your total undivided attention. That is the least she deserves, and it is the standard by which I have failed. If you are currently struggling with the urge to reach out to an ex, I want you to imagine the person you are currently with. I want you to imagine them finding out. Imagine the look on their face, not of anger, but of that soul-crushing quiet disappointment that I saw on Elena's face. Imagine them realizing that they were never the priority, but merely a placeholder. If you can imagine that and it doesn't make your stomach turn, then you are already further gone than I was. But if it hurts to imagine them in that much pain, then stop right now. Put the phone down, delete the number. The ghost isn't worth the ruin of the living. I'm sitting here in the wreckage of a life I thought was going to last forever, and I'm telling you the what if is not a door to a better life. It is a trap. It is a way to lose everything you have while chasing something that has no substance. Keep your life, protect your home, cherish the person who wakes up next to you every single morning and chooses to stay. That is a miracle. It is a rare, beautiful, and fragile miracle, and it is the only thing in this world that actually matters. Don't let your own ego convince you otherwise. Don't let the ghost win. The silence that follows a mistake like this is the longest, coldest, and most unforgiving thing you will ever experience. Choose the person in the room with you, and never ever let the past take that away. The weight of these past few months has been a slow motion education in consequence. When I first sat down to write this, I thought perhaps there was a secret, a missing piece of the puzzle, that would make the world understand why I did what I did. I thought maybe if I explained the first love connection enough, if I described the way Sarah once made me feel in those early chaotic years, people would see it as a tragic mistake of the heart rather than a calculated, selfish choice. But that was just my ego speaking one last time, trying to find a loophole in the absolute law of betrayal. There is no loophole. There is only the fact that I held the most precious thing I had, my wife's trust, and I deliberately traded it for the validation of a ghost. And now, the dust has settled, the house is empty, and I am living in the absolute quiet aftermath. I've realized that the first love isn't a holy relic, it's a milestone. And by trying to keep it in a glass case, by keeping it alive through these digital threads, I didn't honor it. I just poisoned my present. I see now that the most important thing a person can possess isn't the ability to keep their options open or the charm to draw people in. It's the ability to shut the door. It's the discipline to protect the sanctuary you've built from the winds of the past. I didn't have that discipline. I was a man who wanted to be everything to everyone, and in the end, I became nothing to the only person who actually mattered. The regret isn't a sharp pain anymore. It's a constant dull thrumming like a siren in the distance that never stops. If you're listening to this and you're feeling the pull of an old flame, or you're thinking about reaching out to someone you once had a connection with, look at your current life. Look at the person who shares your bed, the person who knows your flaws and loves you anyway, the person who is actually present in the messy, difficult, beautiful work of building a life. That person is your miracle. Everything else, every text, every nostalgic memory, every what if is just noise. And if you're not careful, that noise will drown out the most important thing you'll ever have. I have to live with the knowledge that I lost the woman who made my life worth living. I have to live with the knowledge that I am the one who introduced the rot. And while I know I'll never get her back, I have found a strange, grim peace in the truth. I am finally the man I was supposed to be, someone who takes responsibility, someone who doesn't hide, someone who knows that the past has no place in a home built on the future. I'm sharing my wreckage with you because I want you to build something better. I want you to realize that being a good partner isn't about being perfect. It's about being present. It's about having the strength to say no to the ghost so you can say yes to your partner every single day. My life is quiet now, and I've earned this silence. I'm going to keep working on myself, keep learning how to be the kind of a man who deserves the love he once had, even if I never get to experience that kind of love again. If you've learned anything from this, let it be this. Don't gamble with your sanctuary. The stakes are much higher than you think, and the price of losing is a silence that you can never fill. Cherish your person, protect your home, and if the past comes knocking, don't just close the door, lock it, and never look back, because the only love that matters is the one that is currently fighting for you in the light of day. Thank you for listening to my story. I hope your life is built on a foundation that stands, and that you never have to stand where I am staring into the empty rooms of a life you destroyed yourself. Bye.